Welcome, chess enthusiasts. Today we have an exciting game from the 45th FIDE Chess Olympiad 2024, featuring Gukesh D playing as white against Caruana as black. Let's dive into the moves and see how the game unfolded. White begins by advancing the pawn to the d4 square, aiming to control the center of the board. Black responds by moving the knight to the f6 square, maintaining flexibility and preparing to develop other pieces. White continues with the pawn to the c4 square, indicating the intention to dominate the center with pawns. Black plays the pawn to the e6 square, preparing to develop the bishop and possibly entering the Nimzo-Indian defense. White then moves the pawn to the g3 square, preparing to fianchetto the bishop. Black responds by advancing the pawn to the d5 square, establishing a strong presence in the center. White fianchettos the bishop to the g2 square, aiming to control the long diagonal. Black develops the knight to the c6 square, increasing pressure on the center. White develops the knight to the f3 square, supporting the central pawn. Black moves the rook to the b8 square, preparing to exert pressure on the b file. White captures the pawn on d5 with the pawn, opening the center. Black responds with a check by moving the bishop to the b4 square. White blocks the check by moving the knight to the c3 square. Black captures the pawn on d5 with the pawn. White develops the bishop to the g5 square, pinning the knight on f6. Black responds by advancing the pawn to the h6 square, attacking the bishop. White captures the knight on f6 with the bishop. Black recaptures with the queen. White castles kingside, bringing the king to safety. Black captures the knight on c3 with the bishop. White recaptures with the pawn. Black castles kingside, bringing the king to safety. White moves the knight to the d2 square, preparing to reposition it. Black develops the knight to the e7 square. White advances the pawn to the e3 square, preparing to develop the bishop. Black develops the bishop to the e6 square. White moves the queen to the a4 square, attacking the knight on c6. Black responds by advancing the pawn to the a6 square. White advances the pawn to the e4 square, attacking the center. Black counters by advancing the pawn to the c5 square. White moves the queen to the a3 square, maintaining pressure on the center. Black advances the pawn to the b6 square. White moves the rook to the b1 square, preparing to exert pressure on the b file. Black moves the rook to the e8 square. White captures the pawn on c5 with the pawn. Black advances the pawn to the d4 square. White advances the pawn to the c4 square, blocking the pawn. Black moves the queen to the g5 square. White moves the rook to the d1 square, preparing to contest the d file. Black captures the pawn on c5 with the pawn. White advances the pawn to the f4 square, attacking the queen. Black moves the queen to the h5 square. White advances the pawn to the f5 square, attacking the queen. Black captures the rook on b1 with the rook. White recaptures with the rook. Black moves the queen to the e2 square. White captures the pawn on e6 with the pawn. Black captures the pawn on d2 with the queen. White gives a check by advancing the pawn to f7. Black captures the pawn with the king. White captures the pawn on c5 with the queen. Black moves the king to the g8 square. White moves the rook to the f1 square, preparing to attack. Black moves the king to the h7 square. White moves the queen to the e5 square, attacking the king. Black gives a check by moving the queen to the e3 square. White moves the king to the h1 square. Black advances the pawn to the d3 square. White moves the bishop to the h3 square, attacking the pawn. Black advances the pawn to the d2 square. White moves the bishop to the g4 square, attacking the queen. Black moves the queen to the d3 square. White moves the king to the g2 square, preparing to escape. Black captures the pawn on c4 with the queen. White advances the pawn to the a4 square, preparing to push further. Black moves the queen to the c6 square. White moves the queen to the d4 square, attacking the queen. Black moves the queen to the g6 square. White moves the rook to the f4 square, attacking the queen. Black moves the queen to the g5 square. White advances the pawn to the h4 square, attacking the queen. Black moves the queen to the g6 square. White captures the pawn on d2 with the queen. Black moves the rook to the b8 square. White moves the queen to the d7 square, attacking the rook. Black advances the pawn to the h5 square. White moves the bishop to the e6 square, attacking the rook. Black moves the rook to the b6 square. White moves the bishop to the f7 square, attacking the rook. Black moves the queen to the d6 square. White captures the queen with the queen. Black recaptures with the rook. White captures the pawn on h5 with the bishop. Black develops the knight to the c6 square. White moves the bishop to the e2 square, preparing to reposition. Black advances the pawn to the a5 square. White moves the bishop to the b5 square, attacking the knight. Black moves the knight to the e5 square. White moves the rook to the f5 square, attacking the knight. Black moves the rook to the e6 square. White moves the king to the f2 square, preparing to support the rook. Black resigns the game. Thank you for watching this exciting game between Gukesh D and Caruana. Don't forget to follow our channel for more thrilling chess content.